were growing up about people like Père Marquette and Joliet, these early French explorers who came in the 1670s and 1680s into Wisconsin and into northern Indiana. This is a map from, I think, 1755, so right at the end of the French period. But you can see, though they have Lake Michigan running at sort of a funny angle, the clear interest in all of this exploration was waterways. We think so much about highways, but the important thing right through the period of early settlement here was how to get around by water, and what they were looking for was a way to get from the Great Lakes to New Orleans, which LaSalle found in the portage from the St. Joseph River to the headwaters of the Kankakee. So that's the important business about all this from their point of view. But in the process of that important business, they certainly were also interested in saving souls. Père Marquette himself was a Jesuit, and all these early parties, most of these early parties, had Roman Catholic clergy of one sort or another traveling with them. So there was an established Catholic missionary presence through all of our area, and then down, obviously, all the way down to New Orleans in the French part of French North America. And that lasts through the French and Indian Wars till Montreal falls to the British in 1760, and then there's the Treaty of Paris, and eventually the French king calls back all the missionaries to France in 1764. So after that, the Native Americans who had converted to Catholicism were on their own. There weren't any more Catholic missionaries this side of the Appalachians to minister to them. So there's a long gap here, gaposis of whatever, 40, 50, 60 years, until there is an opportunity, once the American Revolution has happened, once France is an ally of the Americans and so on, for the French to begin to return to the same territory, to return to this area that had once been New France. So this is a map from 1825, it's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but a map from 1825, and you can see our area a little more clearly now. The Yellow River and the Kankakee are maybe a little bit confused up in this neck of the woods here, but they have the general idea, at least, of how things work. And most importantly, you can see actually labeled up here the portage from the St. Joseph to get down into the Kankakee watershed. So that's clearly, even the 1820s, still the important thing about the area. So the early days of our subject, the early days of the second missionary period here in northern Indiana in Marshall County, partly this is a matter of when were our big figures born, but also there were things actually happening. So our leader, I guess, the driving figure behind all this is Bishop Bruté. He's born in 1779, which means that he's 10 years old at the beginning of the French Revolution, the taking of the Bastille. And as a little boy, Bruté actually smuggled communion into prisoners of the Revolution, so very much on the Catholic side during the time of the very much anti-Catholic phase of the French Revolution. He grew up born to wealth but living in poverty. His father had been involved in the French legal system, and they had expectations of becoming a very wealthy family indeed, but his father died early, leaving the mother to raise money for the family, which she did by taking over a legal publishing business. Then that was kiboshed by the Revolution because, of course, all the laws changed. And then the laws changed again under Napoleon, but she managed to at least make some living to keep the Bruté family running. So we'll come back to him, but that's his early background. Menominee is born sometime around 1790, 1791. Obviously, they weren't necessarily keeping the kinds of records we might like to see, but judging from the time he died and comments made when he died, it looks like he was probably born in 1790. Bruté went to medical school, getting back to him for a second, and then joined an order of French clergy that specialized in taking people who would have preaching as their second careers. So while it was unusual on the big scale for someone to get medical doctor and to become a priest, within his order that was a fairly common thing. And as we'll see when we get down to him, Benjamin Petit was trained as a lawyer, and then through the same order became a priest. So
for their particular group, it was common to be something else and then a priest, even though on the bigger scale that wasn't all that common. Bruté was clearly marked out as a brilliant guy during his time in France. Napoleon actually offered him a job in 1804 to become a chaplain to the emperor, which he refused to do. In 1808, I'm sorry, not 1804. And then he comes to the U.S. in 1810 and is active in Maryland, working in seminaries, being a university president. Very much one of the big figures in Maryland, which of course had been a Catholic colony originally, as the name perhaps suggests, Maryland. He was involved in all the different Catholic educational activities going on there during his early time in the U.S. Petit is born in 1811. He's much younger, obviously. In 1821, Menominee, out of an interest in continuing the Christian welfare of his people, he's something of a charismatic leader himself. He's not necessarily the supreme chief even of our local folks in Twin Lakes, and certainly Pokagon up in Michigan was regarded at least as being, insofar as there was a single leader of the Potawatomi, Pokagon would have been that person more than Menominee would have been. But Menominee's interested. He knows that there is a Christian preacher in Fort Wayne, this character named Isaac McCoy. So Menominee goes over to Fort Wayne to visit Isaac McCoy, who's actually a Baptist, and says, would you come visit my people? We've been without the benefit of clergy since before I was born. Maybe you could come and help. So McCoy actually comes over from Fort Wayne to Twin Lakes to visit Menominee's people, and Daniel MacDonald has a version of McCoy's account of visiting at the time, which you can read. McCoy's opinion of Menominee isn't necessarily all that high. He doesn't like the food he's served. He doesn't like the way things look necessarily, but he respects the fact that they've kept it going, and he comments, though he doesn't quote the exact words, he comments that Menominee's people are still praying, so clearly still praying the Catholic prayers that had been handed down to them by their parents and grandparents, even though they haven't had any clergy benefit. Menominee, who at this point is unbaptized, has nonetheless been preaching for his people, so he compares notes with Isaac McCoy to see which of them has preached more sermons. Because Menominee's been making marks in a stick every time he preaches, so he could keep count of how many sermons he's preached. And he eventually decides that he knows more about this than McCoy does, and besides, McCoy isn't really a Catholic, so it doesn't happen. McCoy does open an Indian school in Pokagon's territory up in St. Joseph, and he's involved in other ways. This reminds you of how few people there were, both on the Native American and on the English side, that McCoy married the sister of a character named William Polk, who's going to come into our story a couple of times. Polk eventually is the leader of the Trail of Death business. Polk himself had been kidnapped by Indians as a child and grown up and then gone back to the English world. And also Menominee has with him, when he comes to visit here, a boy who's been part of his Indian education program, a full-blooded Potawatomi named Abraham Burnett. He's named Nanweshma, but he's known as Abram Burnett because he had been adopted by a half-blood Potawatomi named Abraham Burnett, who lived down by Logansport. In fact, at one point there was a Burnett'sville down in the Logansport territory. So the older Burnett adopts the younger Burnett, and they both have the same name, which is mildly confusing. But Abram Burnett shows up in this story again right at the end in the story of Father Petit. So you just see how short a time span was happening and how few people there are in the cast of characters. Okay, so McCoy opens this mission up in Niles, and he's having some success getting people to be Baptist, but clearly in the minds of the Potawatomi, the Catholic Church is what they want. So Father Leopold Pokagon, the head chief, so to speak, eventually gets a Catholic priest named Frederick Rosé to come to St. Joseph and to baptize Leopold and Elizabeth Pokagon, which he does on July 22nd. And eventually this guy becomes the Bishop of Detroit, though not until 1833. And Buchanan then says, okay, I've been baptized, my wife has been baptized, we clearly want Catholic ministers, send us somebody. So he sends to Detroit, and the vicar general there sends them a priest, Stephen Bedin, this is him, and Mademoiselle Angélique Campeau. And again, Mademoiselle Campeau shows up in the story over and over and over again as we go along. Bedin was the first person ordained to the Catholic ministry in America, as opposed to having to go back to be ordained. Very learned, but also, as we say in the trade, no spring chicken. So his coming down here to work was a sacrificial effort on his part. And after 1832, Bedin and Mademoiselle Campeau have the company, or they're replaced by Father Louis de Seille, who was the pastor for this area. And again, his parish is sort of everything north from Logansport to St. Joseph and from Fort Wayne to Chicago. So it isn't like they just had Twin Lakes, and in fact their headquarters, generally speaking, was at South Bend or at St. Joseph. So by the time we get to the 1830s, we're entering into treaty period. And this is, of course, no surprise to any of us. All these treaties were signed, and virtually none of them were honored, at least not in their details. This painting is by George Winter, and again, the small scale of this. George Winter, this British guy who just happened to be in Logansport and available to paint things in our area at just the right time. He knew everybody, he saw everything. This actual painting is from a conference at Bruce Lake towards the end of the period. But I like it because we can identify the characters. In particular, the guy in the white jacket is Niswagi, who was the chief spokesman of the Potawatomi from around Lake Maxinkuckee, and had a reservation that is on the east shore of Maxinkuckee. So if you remember, Bigley's Orchard was the sales area of Bigley's Orchard is where Niswagi's cabin was. So he was right in that area. In any case, the relevant treaties to our purpose are one that was signed in 1832 and one that was signed in 1836. This works a lot better when I talk right into it, doesn't it? I'm sorry, I keep wandering away.
It's portable.
Oh, there you go. Well, with that, I have to talk with my hands. The Treaty of 1832 is the Treaty of Chippewa, and those of us who are old enough to remember going over the old scary bridge to Rochester before new 31 was put in. On the south end of that bridge, there are two historical markers. One of them is for the Michigan Road, and the other is for the signing of the Treaty of Chippewa there in October of 1832. And it was that treaty that established the reservations in our area. So the purple one, the one outlined in blue or purple, is Oganawbi, who got by far the largest territory, though it bumped over into Fort Lewis, was in Fulton County. The little red one is Niswagi, whom we were talking about, and then the green one is Menominee, the relevant one for our purposes today. In 1836, just to jump ahead, as long as I'm talking about treaties, there's a second rash of treaties that goes on, and the Treaty of 1832 and others like it were about making Indian reservations. The treaties from 36 on are all about getting the Indians out. And generally speaking, the provisions of these treaties are sign it, you've got 2 years to leave. So the one of 1836, August 5th, is important because it means that they have to leave by August 5th of 1838, and it's important because Menominee didn't sign it, a point that he kept making over and over and over again. This is a close-up version of Menominee's reservation. You can see it, I don't know how easy it is to read, but I'm going to very daringly take this out. But here's the Yellow River. Here are some of the lakes. Obviously, they didn't get all the lakes into the picture. The village is marked there in a second. You can just barely see the word village. And then you can tell that Dixon Lake is vanished entirely. It's just a little stream running off this direction. But what this does tell us is the lake's down here, the village was considerably north of where the lakes are. And Kurt Garner says the easiest way to think about it is if you're driving past the aggregate plant on Pear Peach Road, the aggregate plant is pretty much where the village was, so that it was that far north between 12th and 11th roads as you go down that side of the county. stable, good.
Are you saying east of 31?
No,
The aggregate plan- there's an aggregate
west
plan
of
out there?
31, yeah. So if you know where Peach and Pear Roads
Yeah,
are,
yeah.
if you were going down towards the monument to Chief Menominee, before you get that far south, and so if you went on 12th Road,
Mhm.
and as you head between 12th down to 11th, I'm sorry, the other way around, you head from 11th down to 12th. 12th is where there's that intersection.
Yes.
Right, so as you're going down the road between 11th and 12th, on your right, there's a little aggregate plant, and that's where the village would have been. So the southern edge of the village territory would have been along 12th Road, right next to the crippled children's camp. So that's the
Okay.
stretch we're talking about.
Okay.
I navigate by things that used to be 3 or 4 years ago, right? Where the children's camp used to be, right after where the Indian village was, right? A true sign of being a Hoosier, nothing else. So, we get into the 1830s, and this is already the gathering storm, as I call it, to be dramatic. This is where all the things start to come together. We mentioned that Seille was baptized in 1834, Menominee was baptized in 1834. He takes the baptismal name of Alexis. You rarely hear him referred to, I think, as Alexis Menominee. It's almost as Chief Menominee, but Alexis was his name, like Leopold Pokagon and Simon Pokagon. He did use a French-style name along with his native name. There had been only one Catholic diocese for all of North America, but by the time we're looking at, the Pope has realized that North America is really big and this is not a practical plan. So more and more dioceses are getting created, and in particular, in 1834, the Diocese of Bardstown, Kentucky gets split at the river, creating the new Diocese of Vincennes. So this then requires someone to be the Bishop of Vincennes, and poor Simon Bruté de Rémur is picked. He resists, he appeals to friends in France, he really doesn't want to be the bishop of anything, much less the Bishop of Vincennes, which is, to put it politely, in the middle of nowhere. But nonetheless, he's prevailed upon by the Pope, and so in the fall of 1834, he goes to St. Louis. In St. Louis, they are just now dedicating what's now the old cathedral in St. Louis, then the new cathedral in St. Louis, which means that they have several bishops there, and having several bishops together is a prerequisite for consecrating another one. So Bruté goes there, he's consecrated as bishop in October of 1834. He and some of his co-consecrators come back to Vincennes, and he arrives there in November of 1834. So we can leave him in his job for a minute. Now back here, Father de Seille is riling up the Indian agents. It does not appear, as far as I can tell, he was doing anything particularly illegal, but he was certainly encouraging them to stand up for their rights and to abide by the treaties that they had signed and the treaties that they hadn't signed. And as far as the Indian agents concerned, that made them pesky foreign agents, right? I mean, he's still a French citizen, and so he keeps getting these sterner and sterner letters warning him that he shouldn't be interfering in American political affairs. And I should mention this, but all of these things you can find in the translation of Petit's letters and journal, which we actually have a copy here in the museum. But Petit's materials were scattered in various places, some of them in France, some of them at Notre Dame, some of them in the Archdiocesan Chancery, which eventually the Diocese of Vincennes was in Indianapolis, so they're in Indianapolis now. But a teacher at Culver in the 40s, I think it is, translates all this stuff for the Indiana Historical Bureau and writes a nice historical essay introducing all the material. So if you're interested in going to any of this in more detail, it's all conveniently in one little pamphlet of maybe, 100 pages, translated from the French and conveniently footnoted, with a copy available just right here in the next room if you need it. It's also online, but if you like to read physical books, you can get it right here in our collection. All right, so de Seille. He's making himself less and less welcome to the Americans, and perhaps knowing that, but also because he's going to have to own property as a bishop, Bishop Bruté in March of 1835 takes out American citizenship. So he can no longer be accused of being a foreigner, and also that means that people can give him land for cathedrals and churches and things like that. So he celebrates Easter, and after that he decides to tour his territory to see this vast area that he's been put in charge of. So he takes off with Father Rémur and makes the trip north. He goes all the way to Chicago, which is out of his jurisdiction, but interesting, obviously. Stops there, and then comes back east from Chicago along the toll road, I guess, along the southern edge of the lake, goes up into St. Joseph and visits the chapel that Seille has there at Waukegan's village, and then heads south. You can read Bruté's version of visiting Seille's chapel at Waukegan's village in MacDonald's History of Marshall County. Now, it shouldn't be there because, of course, it's not in Marshall County, but apparently MacDonald read the wrong page and thought that the description of St. Joseph was a description of Twin Lakes. And this has caused enormous confusion because every time somebody tells you something about Twin Lakes and what the chapel at Twin Lakes looked like, they're almost always quoting from MacDonald, and MacDonald is describing St. Joseph not here. So go forth armored in the knowledge that what you read in MacDonald is actually in Michigan, and then you can read it happily to see, generally speaking, what these chapels look like. So Bruté does come here, though. He meets the Indians. They are so happy to meet not just a black robe, but the head of the black robes, or the black robes of the Jesuits and the other Catholic priests. So he's here for a couple of days. People are delighted to have him. He makes a great impression. And then he heads south to Tippecanoe and his people there before eventually going on back to Vincennes. So the people at Tippecanoe have built a chapel, and Father de Seille comes back and he talks it up amongst the locals, I guess. And so by June, this was happening around Easter time, so by June, Father de Seille can write to Bishop Bruté down in Vincennes and say, your Indians here at Twin Lakes have built a chapel for you. They're so happy to see their head black robe that they built a chapel. So we know exactly when the chapel at Twin Lakes was built. It was built in June of 1835. I mention this because there's a sign that says exactly the opposite if you go down there. We know the facts from the letters. It's from June of 1835. So Bruté, now that he's seen the territory and knows how much he has to cover, he realizes he needs help. So he goes back to France to recruit. He picks up 20-some young men who will come back with him, and among them is Benjamin Marie Petit, newly graduated from seminary, educated as a lawyer, and in a sense, the American Indian agents' worst nightmare, because they felt that having de Seille as an Indian sympathizer was bad enough. Obviously, having a lawyer working for the Indians is going to be even worse, though they don't know that yet. So in 1836, I mentioned this earlier, but now we're getting to it in its right order. In 1836, Abel C. Pepper, the Indian agent, negotiates the Yellow River Treaty with leaders other than Menominee. That's in August, and then in November, already Menominee issues a letter to a protest saying, I didn't sign anything, and as we'll see, he does this again on November 15th, and then in 1837 on the 6th of April, the 15th of May, the 12th of June, and he sends these to everybody, to Tipton, to the President, to the Secretary of War. It isn't the case that they got here in 1838, started to round people up, and suddenly Menominee stood up and waved his hand and said, wait a minute, I didn't sign anything. From the beginning, Menominee let everybody know that he hadn't signed anything, and of course, people paid no attention at all. So Petit arrives in Vincennes with all the other people. The expectation is he's going to have a usual couple of years of training as a priest, and in fact, he's ordained as a subdeacon, the first of the major orders in 1836, for the last of the trivial orders. So, getting back to our guys, they are not that far away. The 1830s is almost 200 years, but that's not very far away. And down here in the bottom of the picture, we have Emma Houghton Dixon, my first cousin, 6 times removed, and equally closely related to Mrs. Kelly. Emma Houghton Dixon knew these guys, and we have from Daniel MacDonald her memories of what they were like. So this is what Emma Houghton says. She's writing in the 1880s when she was, only 60 years old. She says, my recollection is not very clear, but as I remember him, Menominee was a large, fine-looking man, square-built, tall, rather stern-looking. I would think he would be brave and determined in whatever he undertook that he thought was right. I lived with my father, John Houghton, this is the original treasurer of the county, about midway between Menominee village and Benack village, and the Indian trail between the two villages ran close by our cabin. She lived on 13th Road, just this side of the animal shelter. So if you picture coming from the animal shelter, the road makes a bend to the north and then straightens out again. She lived right where that bend was. In his travels between these two villages, Menominee would nearly always stop to get something to eat and drink. Along this trail, there would sometimes be 20 or 30 Indians go and come daily, especially when they had meetings of any kind. So again, the relationship between at least the first bunch of pioneers and the natives was much different than we might have imagined from Western movies. A Menominee stops in your house for a cup of coffee on his way to and from his business for the day. It was a more social business than we remember it being, or than we imagined it being. She goes on to say, I cannot remember much about the old Indian chapel, only that it was a rough-hewn log building, and the cross at the end of the building was of the same material as the house. The priest, Father Petit, was of medium height and rather nice-looking. He talked in the French language. A French woman, this is Mademoiselle Campeau again, a French woman interpreted his sermons in the Potawatomi language to the Indians, but I cannot remember now how she looked to me. It was a sad sight to see the Indians forced away, for the lands were taken by fraud. The government would treat for their land and give firewater to drink, and while drinking, the chiefs would sign their rights away. So in 1837, in May, the Indian agents have had enough, and they throw out Seille and Mademoiselle Chapeau along with them. Seille goes back to South Bend, and Mademoiselle Chapeau comes here to Plymouth. Campo, not even saying Campo, her name is Chapeau, her name is Campo with a C and no H. At the end of September, again, just so we're following the ordinary calendar, Petit is ordained a deacon. Again, the expectation would be that in 6 months or a year he'd be ordained a priest. But then 3 days later, Seille dies up at Notre Dame. And his death, in a sense, emphasizes how thinly spread things are, because ordinarily, of course, there would have been someone to give him the last rites, to give him communion. There was no one. The nearest priests were in Chicago and Fort Wayne. The priest in Logansport was out at the time. And so Seille gives himself communion and dies. And we'll see later, there's a picture, a painting in the log cabinet, the log chapel at Notre Dame, of Seille's last communion with the Potawatomi followers sitting around. So Seille dies, and as soon as they hear about it, Mademoiselle Campeau and Menominee and the others write to Bruté from here in Plymouth, and they say, send us another priest. Bruté only has two people, a German who drinks a lot, and he doesn't think that's a good, he has commented actually, it's in his letters, he comments on the fact that Seille became a teetotaler in order to work amongst the Potawatomi. So sending this German and his taste for the good stuff doesn't seem a wise idea. So the only other thing he can do is ordain Petit, which he does. And so Petit, who had expected to be a deacon for another 6 months or so, is suddenly a priest and tossed onto a horse with the Blessed Sacrament around his neck and a chalice in his hand to go off to the Indians. This is, he comes through Lafayette and Logansport, so 265 miles for this young French guy who's never been anywhere in the American wilderness by himself. And he comes to South Bend and to Twin Lakes arrives here on November 3rd of 1837, just the day before Menominee files his first protest against the Yellow River Treaty. So all of the players are on the stage at this point. Petit is here, traveling back and forth between South Bend and Twin Lakes and other spots. He writes to his, not to the bishop, but to one of his colleagues at one point that he has made the mistake of riding from Plymouth to South Bend without putting on underwear, and then it turns out to be a mistake he's not going to repeat again. So, what can I tell you? It's 1838. In March of 1838, the Potawatomi chiefs, including Menominee, travel to Washington and meet with Martin Van Buren, the only president, by the way, to have grown up speaking a foreign language. But German was the foreign language he spoke. the idea that if you looked at Pioneer Marshall County and said, who here has met the President of the United States, the only person who could put up his hand was Menominee, gives you a sense of how cosmopolitan Menominee was in the first place, and how bizarre the whole situation was on the larger scale. But meeting with them, of course, did no more good than any of these other things did. And by the 26th of March, Menominee's party in Cincinnati headed back here. On the 1st of April, Petit writes to Bruté and says there's been no news from Washington, I don't think there's anything coming to this. And on April 4th, he writes to his family a rather lengthy letter, but you'll forgive me for reading a longish part of it. He says, I now face the sad prospect of my Indian mission's early destruction, and it is like a dark background to the picture of my present life. I begin to feel, however, more resigned. A trip to Washington has been without effect. My poor Indians have only one chance left, and will they succeed, God knows. As for me, I must dry their tears when they go into exile. I must destroy the altar in the church, lay low the cross which stands on their graves, in order to spare the sacred articles from profanation, and then I must say farewell to those whom I love and who love me so much, never to see them again. In June of 1838, Congress passes a thing called the Preemption Act. It's actually a renewal of an earlier law. And if you kind of squint and look at it sideways, it sort of says that you can settle on the Indian territory if you know they're about to leave, and that way you'll have a right to buy it immediately as soon as it becomes available. Daniel McDonald points out that's what it actually says, but that's what everyone interpreted it to mean. In June already of 1838, 400, 500 other Indians have been gathered to Twin Lakes. In 1838, in July, Petit sends another letter to Bruté saying, we know now that everything has failed. We can't file a court case. The president has said no. The Secretary of War has said no. August 6th, of course, is the last date for departure. So on August 4th, Petit dismantles the chapel. There's a last visit to the graveyard on the 3rd of September. And then the removal begins on September 4th, which is a Tuesday. And as we know, on September 6th, they arrive in Logansport, and they're camped in Logansport through the 9th. This picture is from Logansport on the afternoon of that Sunday. Bruté had an appointment to be in Logansport, entirely related to Potawatomi. He was supposed to dedicate a new church. So he goes to South Bend, picks up Petit, brings Petit with him to Logansport, and says, okay, you say a last mass for your people in the morning while I'm dedicating the new church, and then I'll come over in the afternoon and do confirmations, which he does. So this is George Winter again. George Winter, who painted the picture of the consul at Bruce Lake, doing a sketch of the confirmations at Logansport. So under the tent, you can make out the flat there in the middle. Under the tent, presumably, are Bruté and Petit and whoever else is working with them. And then the Indians gather around outside as the bishop does the confirmations. We know, because it's mentioned in Petit's letter, that Petit actually saw this sketch, because for whatever bizarre reason, Winter, after he left Logansport, went to South Bend. And he was at the stagecoach station in South Bend at some point. And meanwhile, Petit had been pestering Bruté to let him go with the people all the way to Kansas. And Bruté said, I've got 3 priests for half of the state. What can I do? But Petit pestered him so much that finally Bruté gave in. He said, all right, you can go with them. Of course, by then they were already on the road again. So Petit had all these things in South Bend. He had to go back to South Bend, get his stuff, and go to catch up. And so it was when Petit was getting ready to leave South Bend that he ran into George Winter. And George Winter said, oh, you were that guy I saw in Logansport. Here's the drawing I made. So Petit mentions seeing this drawing by this crazy English guy, and then he takes off on the rest of his road, and George Winter has the rest of his career, including eventually painting a picture of Petit. Petit catches up with them in Danville, Illinois. They pause at Catlin, Illinois, and this is when General Tipton decides to come back to Indiana with most of the soldiers, leaving a squad or 2 squads of 15 or so. And Polk, the guy we mentioned from earlier, who had originally been a child captive, takes over for the remainder of the trip. After a couple of days, Polk realizes that Petit has far more influence over these people than he does, and so Polk appoints Petit as the official government interpreter at a salary of $245 for the rest of the trip. And we know the story. They make the terrible journey. They eventually get to the Mississippi. They cross at Quincy, Illinois on a steamboat. And the second half of the journey is somewhat better than crossing Illinois because they finally allowed the Indians to hunt, which improved the food supply considerably. They travel all the way across Kansas and up across Missouri and come to Potawatomi, Kansas on November 4th. The destination to which they were taken in Kansas is not one where they stayed long, because Petit realized he would be able to stay with them. He wanted to arrange for their spiritual care, and there was a German Jesuit a few miles away at St. Mary's Mission, Father Houghton, and so Petit arranges for the Potawatomi to go stay with Father Houghton so that they will have again a Catholic priest available to them. So they're very briefly at their original destination, and they travel a mile or two farther to be with St. Mary's Mission. So he stays there through the fall. He gets a letter from Bruté that has actually been sent fairly early, not long after he left, but it takes a while to get a letter to Kansas. So eventually he gets a letter in December that says, "Come home, I need you, you can't stay there forever." And in January, he starts off on the way back. He's been sick on and off all the way, and his companion on the way back is Abraham Burnett. Remember Abraham Burnett from back in 1821, a little boy who was in the Indian school, now a grown man, and he accompanies accompanies Petit on the way back. Eventually they have to throw Petit in the back of a wagon. He can't travel anymore. But they haul him back as far as St. Louis, and in St. Louis he's put into a hospital room in the Jesuit seminary that eventually becomes St. Louis University, and everyone realizes he's not going to make it. So on the 2nd of February, they bring in a portable altar so that he can say one last mass, and then he dies there in St. Louis on the 10th of September, the 10th of February. Bishop Bruté doesn't survive him by much. He dies in June of 1839. Menominee lives until April of 1841. In 1857, the president of Notre Dame, Father Sorin, sends to St. Louis to get Bruté's remains. They can bring him back to the Log Chapel, where he can be with Seille and Batten and the rest of his predecessors. So this is a picture of the Log Chapel, and as I promised, on the back wall there, you can see the picture of Seille's last communion with his people. The citizen Potawatomi did not stay in Kansas. They were there together with the Prairie Potawatomi, the people who come from Illinois, slightly different cultures. And they made different deals about property. The deal that the citizen Potawatomi made was perhaps not a great one financially, but as part of their property management, one way or the other, and as part of their moving to Oklahoma, they take out American citizenship, which is how they became known as the Citizen Band and then the Citizen Nation of Potawatomi. So they're now located around Shawnee, Oklahoma. So this has been memorialized, as you can imagine, and for that matter, as you know from driving past it. The first memorial is the one that Daniel MacDonald arranges for, that's put up in 1909 on the John McFarland farm. He was the largest stock farmer in the county, and McFarland's farm was chosen partly because he was willing to give the land to put it there, but also because it was right next to the railroad. And in fact, if you go down to the Chief Menominee statue, you can see the diagonal line of woodlands running across the territory there, marking where the railroad came up from Culver and came into Plymouth. So you could get off the railroad very conveniently and see the statue, part of the reason for it being there. This is a picture from the dedication. It says in the handwriting at the bottom, dedication of Chief Menominee Monument by his granddaughter, Julia Pokagon. This is, in fact, as you might have expected, Pokagon's granddaughter, Julia Pokagon, not Menominee's granddaughter, Julia Pokagon. So the inscription is slightly wrong, but you get the effect. The statue was commissioned by a sculptor from Vermont who had never seen a woodland Indian, so he looks a lot more like a Sioux than a Potawatomi with the big Indian headdress. The Potawatomi tended to wear turbans or something like that rather than that. But you get the Indian that you pay for, I guess. But there was also originally a copy of the chapel there. It was a scale model of the chapel, but the territory, the little plot of land there actually had two things on it with the model chapel. And so you can imagine, if you drive up or down the road, you have to imagine getting off the train, you would have looked straight at the statue, and then after you passed the statue behind it, you would have seen the model of the chapel. So that's the first thing, again, due to Daniel MacDonald. As you know, it's the first monument to a Native American put up by any government in the United States. Second monument is this one, dating, I'm guessing, around the 1940s, put up by Howard Grube, who was our surveyor and county engineer in the 30s and 40s. This is the one that's right on the edge of the children's camp. In fact, that's the fence of the camp right behind it there. So it's a little bit east of the intersection of Peach and Pear on 12th Road as you drive west. Grube is interested in this because his family farm was up at the corner of 11th and Peach/Pear. The road changes names at the intersection, which is irritating. But anyway, up on 11th. So his family farm was the one which would have included the original site of the village, or give or take a yard or two. So I assume that's the reason he was interested in putting up this particular monument. I should also say, just out of interest, Grube was one of the early inventors of the idea of numbering roads so that you could tell how far you were east and west, how far you were north and south of the county seat. Of course, ironically, Marshall County didn't use his system, but the counties around us did. So if you drive into Stark County or Fulton County, that's Howard Grube's system that worked. You can see that he says here, Menominee Chapel at Chichipe Otepe, and I have to say at least something about that. Potawatomi and many of the other Native American languages use sounds that don't mean anything in English. And you can tell this, excuse me for being an English teacher for a minute, but you can tell this pretty easily. If you say spin and then pot, go ahead, try it. Spin, pot. Notice there's a little puff of air with the P in pot that isn't there in spin. Doesn't mean anything in English. But in Potawatomi, that means something. On the other hand, in English, the difference between P and B is very important. In Potawatomi, it's meaningless. So if you actually look up Potawatomi language sites, you'll discover that they actually write it Potawatomi, not Potawatomi, except when they're talking to us. So anytime somebody is trying to transcribe something from Potawatomi, it's influenced by the way the European ear hears it, which isn't necessarily the way the Potawatomi mouth intended to be spoken. And in particular, in the case of Father Petit, there's the additional difficulty that he spoke French, not English. So Chichipe Utepe is actually, it appears to be the Potawatomi words Sisipe Wudebe, start with WD, and he heard the WD as W, because of course in French, OU spells W, like in the beginning of we. So that's how we got Chichipe Utepe spelled the way it is. It in fact means duck's head. And I only know this because, as you would imagine, there is a Potawatomi Facebook page. And I wrote to them and said, do you guys have any idea what this could mean? Because all the old English books say it means little duck. And the head of it wrote back to me immediately and said, no, it can't mean little duck. You make little in Potawatomi. It can't be little duck. And then various people kicked it around with this one lady said, what if that OU is a W and then it would mean duck's head? And once you know that it means duck's head, it turns out that in his letters, he says that it means duck's head. But he says it in French, of course. He says, tête du canard. And so the translator from Culver, who did the translation, knew French about Potawatomi and didn't realize it was a translation. So the answer has been there in front of us all this time, but since we didn't have the two pieces together, we didn't know what it was. Anyway, Duck's Head is what they called the territory that they offered to the bishop as a place to build his chapel. And that's where the chapel was built, though not by Father Batin and not in 1827, as we covered earlier. Third memorial, this is on the site in Kansas. This is at St. Mary's Mission, which later became the St. Philippine Duchesne Memorial Park because Philippine Duchesne was a missionary to the Potawatomi. And this is due to our friend Shirley Willard from Fulton County, who did so much local history, particularly so much to do with the Trail of Courage and with pioneer events down in Fulton County and along the whole Trail of Courage. So this is a stone from each of the states that the trail passed through, and then the sign has On the left-hand side, there's more text that talks about Father Petit, and on the other side has a map of the Trail of Death. And then I sort of last and least among these memorials, but in the Episcopal Church, which I belong, we have a system for identifying saints at the local level. I mean, there's like their big, international saints like St. Gregory or someone, St. Peter, St. Paul. But you can also have locally identified saints that your bishop can authorize. And so I suggested to our bishop, Doug Sparks, who's in the picture here, that a Saints' Day for Menominee and Father Petit and their companions would be a good thing, which he agreed with. So the program, the bulletin there, is from the first time that we celebrated them in a communion service at the cathedral up in South Bend. And the relevant thing was that it was the day, you can see Bishop Sparks there has a black and green and colored cross on. It's one that had been presented by the Potawatomi because he was about to take off for walking the Trail of Death, which he did starting the next Monday, starting from the Menominee monument out there. So Bishop Sparks had a particular connection to the Potawatomi and to Father Petit, having walked the whole way. And we now have Petit and Menominee in the calendar of the Episcopal Church in northern Indiana, at least. Whether that spreads to the whole Episcopal Church or not, I can't tell you, but at least around here, they're added to our saints list along with everybody else. So, questions? So we've got 5 or so minutes left. Don't want to go too far because people have to get home. Yes, ma'am?
You said you walked that trail.
Yes.
Is that something that anybody is allowed to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly, just public highways and things between here and Kansas. Yeah, it's a bit of a hike, but yeah, you could do it. I don't think, from the way he talked, I don't think there's any place that isn't public roads. Maybe right at the end, he rode a horse, but I think he rode a horse just to prove a point, not because he was, because he couldn't get there
You
anyway.
wouldn't be trespassing on.
No. In many places, he found that they had monuments put up to the Trail of Death, and they didn't know what they were for. So he came along as sort of a little historical agent himself as he came to some of these small towns. They'd say, well, who are you? Why are you wearing a purple shirt or whatever? He said, well, I'm the Bishop of Northern Indiana, and I'm on this walk, and looking for a place to sleep in a church basement or something. They would put up, and they say, now, explain again why you're walking to Kansas from Indiana. But yeah, other than ignorance, there's no reason anyone couldn't walk it, as far as I know. Yes.
Memorial Forest, and right across the street is the Yellow River. Was there an encampment around there?
No, ma'am. The forest is there, actually, another one of my cousins. The pioneers hunted to extinction beavers and deer. And beavers were, beavers and deer were both reintroduced in southern Indiana in the 1930s rather. And so Sam Jones lived out by Baruch, noticed that there were beavers who had dammed up the river or the stream going into the Yellow River. Mm-hmm. And in the 1930s, that was an amazing thing. Beavers up here in Indiana. So the idea that there was a beaver dam, and then that was all sand dunes. So they could fix the sand dunes by putting in planted trees, led to the idea of the memorial forest. But it wasn't particularly an Indian encampment. There is a confusing sign, I will say that politely, next to the Menominee statue that mentions an Indian encampment on the Yellow River. And this would have been close to Wolf Creek. So if you imagine going down Olive Trail, where the bridge comes across Olive Trail crosses the Yellow River, just a little bit farther upstream from that is where Wolf Creek runs into the river. There was a mill there was a little town. Mrs. Culver, Emily Jane Hand, was born in Wolf Creek. And we know that there was an Indian settlement there, but it predates Menominee and his people. By the time the pioneers got here in the 1830s, it was already an abandoned village. So it may have been an abandoned Potawatomi village, it may have been an abandoned Miami village, but it was not part of the political structure at the time that our things were taking place.
I have one more question.
Yes, ma'am.
Father Sheridan's chapel, his retirement home.
Yeah, my mother went to church
18,
there.
There's some mounds behind that. Is that
No, those are natural,
Okay,
Yeah,
so it's not
that-
Indian mounds or?
not Indian
oh,
mounds.
okay.
No, there were Indian mounds on the south side of Burr Oak, between Burr Oak and that road that you take when there's a train. But they were never scientifically investigated until they had been plowed over so much that there wasn't
Okay,
anything there.
okay,
But there are records of Indian mounds in that area.
okay.
But no, the swales back there are natural results of the
Okay, thank
glaciers.
you.
How about back there, and we'll come up here, yes?
Okay,
Go ahead.
You mentioned where the village was in that aggregate parcel. Is that where the chapel was then, also where the Indians were gathered?
The chapel was probably closer, because all of the references to the chapel seem to suggest that it was right next to the lake. So I would guess that the one thing that's right about the chapel marker, the date is wrong and the person's wrong, but I suspect the rock is in the right place. So I think the rock is pretty much in the right place for where the chapel was. Because what they wanted to do, what they tried to do was give Bishop Bruté an acre there where the chapel was. And of course, when they were run out, then that all fell through. But they intended to give that property to the bishop for a chapel of perpetuity. Yes, sir.
I don't know how far your research goes, because I came into this area a number of years ago, so I didn't know a lot about Potawatomi. But I came from up in Michigan, where Chief Pontiac was big. I always was under the impression that Pontiac was larger than maybe the Potawatomis, and because I lived on Menominee Street.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Pontiac's rebellion brought in a whole bunch of different tribes, and I'm going to be reluctant to say very much about it unless I get things wrong. The Potawatomi themselves were part of an alliance with the Chippewa and the Ottawa, the Ojibwe and the, again, how do you pronounce native languages? But they were the Three Fires Alliance, and the Potawatomi had the specific responsibility for lighting the council fire, which is how they get their name. They don't call themselves the Potawatomi, they're
But did
Anishinaabe.
Menominee and Pontiac have something?
No, Menominee is just a common name. It's like being Joe Smith.
Okay, all right,
Um,
okay.
The Potawatomi were from Michigan, and all of these, actually they were from New Jersey, I think originally, but the effect of fur trade and the Iroquois was that the Iroquois pushed everybody else around. So the Potawatomi get moved into Wisconsin, and then from Wisconsin back to northern Indiana and southern Michigan. So you find the nominees in Wisconsin as well. One last question.
We first moved here, we moved to the Twin Lakes area on Cook Lake Trail. And I was very surprised as I drove around, saw the Menominee statue, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. Did some research. I thought, wow, and I really got into it. And I'm wondering why I had heard of the Trail of Tears, but never the Trail of Death.
The Trail of Tears, the Cherokees was a much bigger enterprise to begin with. Our people, the exodus of our people is important to us because they were ours. 80 people died, I think, off the top of my head. I have the number here, I can look it up, but in that neck of the woods. Moving the Cherokee was a much larger project, and if I remember correctly, they lost a lot more people. So I think that's the answer. It's just, in terms of the impact on American history, it was a bigger issue, yeah. It was only that one trip that was so deadly even for our folks. The Niswaukee and his party were removed the previous year, and they didn't suffer enormous losses. So it was that particular trip that proved so deadly for our local people, at least. I think we've used up our time.
We did get the book for you.
Oh, yes, sorry, yeah, thank you all. So this is the book I was talking about earlier, Father Petit's Letters and Journals, translated. It's a fun read. You get him writing back to France and saying, could somebody send me a watch? Mine is wrong so much of the time I can't tell whether it or the sun is correct. Obviously, didn't like with daylight savings time. And the essay in the front by Irving McKee about how the local history went and putting all these people in context is very useful as well. So it's right there in the next room, filed under Indian removals, and it's a fun read. Also available online. And Bishop Bruté's memoirs are available online as well if you want to read what Bruté himself had to say. Thank you all.